well qualified. I had worked with some various Canadians on different issues, acid rain, free trade. But I really didn't know the width and breadth of the country, and I knew how big and incredibly beautiful it is. So I decided to take with my wife, take a train trip all across the country before I unpacked our bags in the wonderful ambassador's residence in Ottawa. We had our own car. It's via rail, and what a trip. We did it in 2 tranches. The first tranche was Toronto all the way out to Vancouver and Victoria. The second tranche was from St. John's, Newfoundland, all back to Montreal and then Ottawa. And at each place we met with the premiers, the leaders of opposition, the mayors, writers. We did radio talk shows. The first trip, the first leg, was from Toronto to Winnipeg, and that was 28 hours. And about 25 of them, all I saw was water and rock. It's called the Canadian Shield. And traveling with me from point to be our consul general, depending on the region. And of course, we had a consul general in Toronto, Montreal, and Quebec City, and Halifax, and Vancouver, and Calgary. So the consul general from Calgary, who had Manitoba in his jurisdiction, rode with me. And so we got to Winnipeg, and he said, "You're going to see the premier tomorrow, but today you're going to see a guy who's a real up-and-comer. Someday he'll be a big leader in Manitoba. And his name is Gary Doer." And Gary Doer was the leader of the opposition at that time in Manitoba. And I was very impressed, of course, with his knowledge about U.S. politics, but just with Gary Doer generally. Of course, it turned out to be true. He ended up as the premier of Manitoba, served with great distinction for years. Was that 3 elections or 4?
3.
3. Has always been healthcare, has been globally cited as a leader in climate change, in energy. By the way, all the while engaging in what has been widely heralded as strong financial management. And so then in 2009, while he again was serving effectively in Winnipeg as premier, the Prime Minister Harper of the other party decided to reach in across the aisle and go for talent and send, I think, the best public servants that I've ever known down to Washington as Canada's ambassador. I think he's probably, diplomacy, if you do it right in U.S. Canada, it's diplomacy, it's substance, and it's politics, and it's people. So I want to present to you, and he's a great friend of Kuzli here, one of the most gifted leaders in North America, and continues to be not only an effective ambassador, but I will tell you right now, a leader for the future here in the Western Hemisphere, Gary Doer.
Here, here. Thank you very much. Thank you. You just sit down right now. Appreciate it. We now have a consul general office in Winnipeg, 4 more years, as I would say politically. I want to thank you for that kind introduction. I should point out that as we speak, it's snowing in Washington. And apparently there's record temperatures and snow again in Washington. For those of you who have never worked in Washington, you should know that when it snows in Washington, 1 inch of snow will close down the most powerful city in the world for sometimes day after day after day. And so in the Canadian Embassy, they ask us, well, you're from Canada. What do you do with snow? Well, first of all, we go to work. We've heard of a 4-wheel drive car before. I had to get rid of our Lincoln, no disrespect to anybody in any auto company, because it couldn't go up 1 inch of elevation. But in Canada, we take that snow and we shovel it, we lift it, we put it in a dump truck, we dump the snow into the river, we let that snow melt It goes through a turbine, and we sell it back to the United States at 7 cents a kilowatt hour. That's our renewable energy strategy. We keep that sucker open in Washington, and we keep that economy going. And you know, people say, people always talk about this when I tell that story, but we like them to know that we're not just a one-trick pony when it comes to energy and renewable energy with our good friends in the United States. The last time I was in Cleveland, we got hauled away early. Ambassador Jacobson was in a snowstorm, and we drove from here to announce the presidential permit that we obtained on the Detroit-Windsor Bridge. And the narrative in Canada sometimes is, we had a tough time with the administration on this bridge. Actually, I'm here to say that we had another person who gave us a tough time, the owner of the existing bridge, who had some kind of influence on the decisions and the voting pattern in Michigan for decades. And I found out shortly after I got to Washington on the Hill in the United States and in the Congress. I remember having a breakfast with James Blanchard, Ambassador Blanchard, a couple days in, talking about this bridge. And then I talked to a representative on the Hill. I said, you know, this bridge has been talked about for 20 years. We're going to get this damn bridge built. There's got to be a way to do it. Considers it a #1 priority. We're going to get it built. And, why can't we get it built? And he said, well, there's this guy named Manny Mulroon. I said, well, we'll figure out a way to get around this guy. And he said, good luck to you. I've heard this story for a number of years. So we finally went to announce the presidential permit that was approved by President Obama. We had a waiver for Buy America provisions. We had to explain to the United States it wasn't a diving board, it was a bridge, so it came under the Buy American provisions that have been there for 30 or 40 years. We got the Coast Guard approval, as the Admiral's here, thank you very much, from the Cleveland office here in the United States. And then we were left with two outstanding items. That was in the last 6 months, we were left with the Customs Plaza, with capital and the operating. And the instructions we had from the Prime Minister is get a way to get it done. So we got a PPP to finance the bridge itself, and we got approval and support from the Governor of Michigan, Governor Snyder, and every time we ran into an obstacle, we just found a way to just get it done. So on the Customs Plaza, we couldn't get the money from the Hill. Manny's, and I'm not going any further than that because he's got more lawyers than cherry blossoms in Washington, D.C. next month to sue you. How many lawsuits you got going? Over 40 lawsuits, so I'm not up there yet. He's all, okay, well, he's going to win one. I hope it's not me. But you can afford it. We just decided, we got all the operating money, which was reconfirmed at our pre-clearance announcement by Jay Johnson, $100 million the first year and $50 million every year thereafter. And rather than paying for the Customs Plaza, we financed it. Is that perfect? No. But as a taxpayer from Manitoba federally, my taxes don't go to the bridge. If I drive across the bridge, my toll will go to pay for the PPP financing. So I've learned a long time ago, as a former premier, there's no such thing as a perfect deal. You get nitpicked to death. When we did the Forks Peg or the new arena, I got involved in the new arena, which was private sector funded, but we had a little bit of public money in it. I got hammered every day by the nitpicking public, perhaps, or maybe the media, perhaps. I never condemn the media. They never knock anybody that buys their ink by the barrel. We got it done. And I think 5 years from now, people will remember for 20 bloody years we talked about this bridge. We knew it was the biggest security weakness. We knew it represented an economic weakness, and we got it done. And thanks to Governor Blanchard and so many other people in this room, it's happening. It's going to happen. And we're all going to have a bloody beer at the bridge opening in 2020. And Governor Blanchard will buy the beer. And the Canadian beer is stronger Highly recommend it to our American friends, and you can drink at a younger age, but you cannot drink and drive in Canada. You'll go to jail. So that was my recollection of our last meeting here in Cleveland. It hasn't gone as well with the Keystone Pipeline. You might have heard about that. It's really a tale of two cities. That's an overused term. But I looked the other day, and we've had the largest increase of Canadian oil from Alberta go to the United States through any president in the last, I would believe, ever. Over 1 million barrels a year have increased from Canada to the United States in the 6 years President Obama has been in office. And the United States has gone from getting about 19% of their foreign oil from Canada. The last numbers were over 40%, and the amount of oil coming from OPEC countries is down dramatically. So that is one part of the narrative of making North America less dependent upon OPEC oil. The other side of that is the United States has developed a lot of oil, some of which, by the way, is proposed to go on the Keystone Pipeline. You might have heard somebody in the administration, I won't mention any names, but he's got a very big office in the United States saying that all the oil is coming from Canada. Well, actually, who knew that Montana and North Dakota were bequeathed by the president to Canada? Because some of the oil is from the Bakken oil fields and will be shipped in the Keystone Pipeline, as opposed to being trucked or railed as it is now. So this is definitely a problem, not getting a presidential permit for this pipeline. But I would refer to the State Department report last year that predicted that if the pipeline was not built, more oil would be on rail. Rail transportation of crude oil has gone up tenfold in the last 3 years since the pipeline has been delayed. And the State Department, the scientists, have identified 3 liabilities if the pipeline is not approved and the oil is on rail. Number 1 is cost. It's higher cost on rail. Number 2 is safety. They predict 28 deaths if the pipeline is not built over the life period of that pipeline. And the third issue is it has higher emissions, 28 to 42% higher emissions if on rail rather than pipeline. So ironically, this has been made into a climate change debate. If the pipeline is not approved, it's on rail with higher emissions. I think 5 years from now, some historians will look at this and really say this is environmental malpractice to drive all this oil onto rail because there's not the backbone to approve the science from the State Department and approve the pipeline. So one liability is higher emissions. Where is that going to take place? In the United States. The second liability is safety. Where is that risk? It's in the United States. And the third liability is obviously resting with Canada, with cost for producers to go on to rail rather than pipeline. But the bottom line is that oil is going to get to market. It is getting to market. Every month more oil is getting to market. We're expanding existing pipelines. We're increasing capacity in different areas. We just had an announcement in Texas a couple of weeks ago with Enbridge. We have other pipelines we're expanding and improving. But it is really not climate change versus energy. It's really rail versus pipeline. You wouldn't know that, but that's why I believe, I can't say when it's going to be approved and by whom it will approve it, but I do believe that at the end of the day, this pipeline does make sense. But it has been, it was easier to get a bridge approved than it has been a pipeline, in spite of our good friend that owns the existing bridge. I would say, therefore, that, when you look at, are there big ideas and are there big vision items or what are the objectives? We do have big objectives in the Canada-U.S. relations, but I would suggest to you that sometimes they're built with component parts, and each component part sometimes has a fundamental disagreement in a democracy. Stakeholders, single issue opponents or supporters of projects. one-trick ponies that are for or against various areas of development. And when you look at the vision that we're operating under, and when you look at the component parts, starting with Canada and the United States and with Mexico, we are really driving towards having energy independence in North America by 2020. That's what we're driving towards. That's what we believe in. That's what we think makes sense. Certainly as a Canadian ambassador, I speak about it all the time in the United States. We have won the lottery. We just got to figure out how to cash the ticket by building the right infrastructure to get it done. And we do that energy independence strategy in multiple different ways. Four actual components of building energy independence in our neighborhood of North America. Number one is energy efficiency. The light vehicle emission standards that we developed early on not only have allowed us to sell more cars because they guzzle less gas, but we have the largest risk of GHGs was in the vehicles we drove. On television, you would see this smokestack, but actually it was the cars we were driving. And having new light efficiency standards has been very, very important for energy efficiency and reducing demand on a per capita basis in this very, very important area. We're working on rail. We're working on rail alignment with our regulatory energy efficiency that private companies are developing on rail. We're working on ballast water in the Great Lakes. We're working on bunker fuel in the Great Lakes region. And all of that is part of energy efficiency as part of energy independence and having cleaner air and cleaner water. Number two is energy renewables. And this is where I joked about 1 lawyer per megawatt when I was talking about transmission lines. No disrespect at this law school, but CEO of General Electric to Jeff Immelt to the governors last February said it takes up to 6 years to get a transmission line built from one state to another. We did get a presidential permit for Hydro-Quebec through the Champlain-Hudson region in 4 years. But 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, this is not the kind of decision-making we need to have in North America to get to energy independence. We need the public interest and the private interest to be balanced through due diligence, but not to be just never-ending litigation and disagreement on what needs to be happening. The third item is gas. The development is in a safe way with gas. Now, again, just so we don't feel so victimized by not getting the pipeline approved, gas pipelines are being opposed everywhere you go in New England states. They had about a $20 billion hit to consumers 2 years ago on, I was worried it was mine. I forgot to turn it off and I know better. $20 billion, we're trying to get coal, some coal plants reduced with the EPA proposals in New England, but there is an opportunity for hydro power from Canada, again trying to get transmission lines and gas pipelines to New England, and almost every one of those pipelines is being blocked, opposed, disagreed with. And again, why is this happening? It's taking coal, and it's the highest electricity costs in the United States or in the States and California, the two coasts. And this would make it much more reliable and predictable for U.S. consumers. Again, gas, we think, is part of energy independence. And obviously the constitutional changes in Mexico, the development in Eagle Ford and Bakken here in the United States, and the developments of the second largest oil reserve in the world in Canada, we think allows us to have energy independence in this neighborhood. And we think that makes a lot of sense, and that will be excellent result in terms of our economies, our environment, and also our trading relationship with each other. I also think it adds more credibility to trade here in northern United States. I didn't hear President Obama's speech 2 days ago in Cleveland, but I bet you he didn't talk a lot about NAFTA. And there is still some lingering gap between the benefits of NAFTA in the United States and what the public perceive. You can see that actually in the TPA recommendation in Senate right now. People that are opposed to it, voting for the fast track authority in the TPP negotiations, are using NAFTA a lot from northern states, if you're tracking who's saying what, when, on this issue. And I actually think that we should start to try to rebrand the North American neighborhood using energy independence as part of the brand, energy reliance with and resilience with Mexico, Canada, and United States. I just think we've got to keep getting up every morning, not assuming 20 years ago and 25 years ago is something that we can just put in the bank and rely on that being there forever. You always got to get up every morning and win the argument of the benefit for the public interest in every country, including here in the United States. I also believe that on trade, we believe that the TPP is very important. Some people didn't think we'd get to the table. Some people thought we would get to the table only if we had capitulated in a number of items. You know, I used to read about supply management being a condition before we got to the table, and actually we were discussing intellectual property and copyright. That's a secret. Is this being taped? But that was what we were discussing before we got to the table. People were saying, oh, United States is giving us a rough time. I don't know whether Ambassador Jacobs is here or not, but I remember we were on the phone at midnight when they're in Los Cabos talking about Vietnam trying to stop us on the textiles issue and wanting all kinds of conditions before we were allowed to come in by the other 9 countries that had already agreed to come in. I always thought it made really good sense for Canada to be part of that table. We decided in November of 2011 to go to the table after we saw the framework agreement in Hawaii, and table in June. There's a mandatory consultation period in the United States. Every stakeholder almost supported us. Oh, sure. Pork wanted more pork into Canada. Poultry wanted more poultry. Eggs wanted more eggs. Milk wanted more milk, yogurt, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, we're over 18. Trade agreements are not. They're full body contact sports. That's why they hire a lot of you to represent people. You know, it's not a high school debate. It's it's power, leverage. And I think Canada's leverage in TPP and TPA is the fact that, you know, we're popular with Americans in terms of doing business with Canada. Vietnam's got a little harder sell. Some other countries have got a harder sell in the 12 countries. And so when we're dealing with state-owned enterprise, obviously it's something that most of the issues at the table we're agreeing on. Even some items that might be, this is a digital conference and talking about data and data storage and how long you can store it. Even the United States doesn't agree with itself sometimes. You've got, can I say that, Ambassador? That's okay. So you've got the president's budget being 12-year protection, the TPP position 12-year protection from the United States, and you got the president's budget last year being 7 years. We actually try to put those things together to say, aha, maybe the 8-year provision Canada's got might be the compromise for all the folks, or you all, as they say en français. So we're trying to. That's an old story about Gordon Giffen. When he got a rough time about language, he said, "How do you say y'all en français?" And, but I can never repeat that because he's from Georgia, y'all. So so that so what are we doing? Last Monday I was in Richmond. This Monday, Secretary Vilsack was there. We were talking both about TPA. Secretary Vilsack said those Canadians are cagey. They're cagey. They don't want to negotiate with 535 people. They want to negotiate with one entity called the U.S. government. And so I got up after and said, yes, we are cagey. We do want to negotiate with one entity. And why were we both in Richmond? Because we have one senator supporting TPA, Mark Warner. We have one senator that supports TPP, who hasn't said whether they're in favor of TPA. And we were out there together. And then we're going to disagree about COOL, and we're going to disagree about some of the stuff in the final parts of the TPA agreement, but we certainly want to know it's an up or down vote at the end of the day. And yes, people might put motions in and everything else, but we'll figure out how to manage all these issues as we go along. There's a tremendous, I know it's harder to sell a trade agreement on gain. Opportunity and gain is harder to sell with the public than the perceived political pain and the actual political pain. But at the end of the day, you can't sell gain unless you have an agreement. And people will allege pain even if you don't have an agreement. But I do believe you can sell that both together when you get a decent agreement. Beyond the border also comes from a broader vision after 9/11 of dealing with managing risk away from the border, using technology and using a sharing of information to try to manage before it hits the border. We're using the model of NORAD to try to manage risk before it is at the border. And you heard a lot about pre-clearance and a lot of those things. I can assure you that after some of these budget cuts, the whole pre-clearance agreement at 8 airports was on a proposal from some budget people to get rid of during the budget debate. This pre-clearance agreement grand-persons the whole thing, the 8 airports, and then allows us to look at other airports into the future. And it does a lot on rail, it does a lot on other issues. And sometimes our technology, we have technology in Canada and we have technology in the United States, but it's not aligned. We had different technology for luggage. That's not a sovereign hill to die on. There are sovereign hills to die on, but luggage technology inspection is not one of them. And every day we find these little different, oh, ours is better than theirs, or theirs is better than ours. Let's get this aligned. And finally, I just want to say, I do believe that the biggest opportunity and vision issue we're going to have going into the future is going to be water. We are blessed with 20% of the fresh water just down the street. We are blessed with lakes and rivers and oceans that we share. I could speak about that for a long time, but I don't believe we'll be dealing with pipelines 5 years from now. I believe we'll be dealing with opportunities that we have and challenges we have to ensure that our water systems are sustainable and that that I believe should be policy that no diversion of water from one watershed to another. And I spoke about that when I was in in Michigan years ago with the Great Lakes Water Council. No diversion of water from one watershed to another, and no introduction of alien species into water. And the exhibit A and B of that is Asian carp. And we should have those kind of policies in place, take the IJC to the next level, and look at phosphorus in this Lake Erie and other things, and have a common strategy to deal with it. Finally, when you talk about beyond the border, you should know that to our American friends, we are very thankful, appreciative, not appreciative is a better word than thankful, after the 2 terrorist attacks that took place in Canada against 2 soldiers in Canada, the killing of 2 soldiers by 2 terrorist attacks, and the attack on Parliament Hill. The trust we have with the United States, we had the president come out that day and offer not only solidarity for the lost soldiers, the deceased soldiers, but absolute unequivocal support for the trust systems we've built up with the sharing of security risks on either side of the border and the integrity of the border procedures we have put in place with 2 countries. And I mention that because after 9/11, there was allowed to exist a myth that became sometimes people's truth, that the terrorists came through Canada into the United States. And I want you to know one of our busiest times after that attack in Ottawa was to watch every newscast to detect errors and correct them immediately when we heard them on one of the U.S. Media shows. There was a statement made on one show that somebody that said, oh, these 2 people could have lawfully entered. Well, actually, no, they couldn't. They didn't have passports. One was taken away and one was never approved. So, but I think in some ways, we're trying to ensure with the Beyond the Border program that keeping our neighborhood safe is not just talking about it, but by doing it and doing it with trust, so that when there is an attack on either side of the border, we can reassure our publics that we stand together in solidarity against that kind of risk. Finally, I'd just like to say, when we're in the Oval Office, most of the meeting is talking about how we keep this world safer and how we keep our neighborhood safer. The media might ask about this irritant or that irritant, but the two leaders of our two countries spend all their waking hours almost trying to keep the world safer and our own country safer. And you don't always see that, but it's important for you to know that. And at the end of the day, we deal with the irritants, and we'll continue to deal with them, and they're real, and they make a difference, and we'll solve them. But there's a very professional relationship between the two leaders. One goes home to his family late at night and watches basketball, and one goes home to his family late at night and watches hockey. And that's the difference between Canada and the United States. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Anybody want to buy some hydropower?
Let's encourage the students here. We're
Yeah.
delighted you're here, and there's no such thing as a foolish question when you're dealing with Canada-U.S. relations.
Ambassador, regarding your discussion of NAFTA, I look at some of the new ambitious agreements that are going on between Canada, the EU, and Quebec and France that are looking to include things like labor mobility. And I look at the NAFTA agreement, and I think there's been talk for a long time about including labor mobility. On what kind of time frame do you think we'll be able to upgrade that agreement and get that part of it?
Well, I think with Europe, and Ross is here, Jean Charest and I both were hosted by him to guarantee that provinces would be available for procurement reciprocity as part of the agreement, because Europe wasn't going to deal with Canada unless we got some buy-in on procurement at the subnational level. On mobility, I would like to, it's certainly one of the issues that we've placed on the table. We believe we have a lot of support from governors, for example, who see this as very important. We're going to have a meeting of governors, premiers, governors from Mexico and United States and premiers from Canada for the first time ever. And I know that training, skill development, and labor mobility will be one of those items we can talk about. It's harder to deal with the United States on some of these issues because of the immigration impasse in this country. And so we're not as able to get what we think to be modern mobility provisions, both in traditional skills and the creative skills that are developing on both sides of the border. We're going to keep working at it. It's one of Canada's positions at the table, and we believe in it. We think it makes a lot of sense. In the difference between Canada-U.S. immigration is in Canada we have 2/3 skilled immigrants, family. United States is 2/3 family, 1/3 skilled. Even the provision to have, I used to go, a lot of premiers would go down and swoop down on visa students whose visas would expire before they were going back to their country because they couldn't stay in the United States. I noticed Orrin Hatch put that in the Senate law that passed, but it hasn't passed in the House. That's a long answer to a short question. We are committed to it. So talk to your representatives here in Ohio. I don't know whether we're peaking too early in Ohio to support TPA, but young people should speak with one voice about a new generation of trade agreements that includes some of the labor mobility issues you've raised. And has anybody got Sherrod Brown's phone number? Yes.
We've seen the emergence of the Great Lakes Region, Council for the Great Lakes Region, which attempts to bring together provinces in this area. In the west, there's the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. As Canadian ambassador, do you find it a problem when there are these state, provincial organizations that work on certain problems in one region, and then other provincial state organizations working on problems in another region? Do you find it a problem to coordinate all of this, keep in touch with what is happening between the states and the provinces so that there's more or less a coherent policy?
Well, more or less a coherent policy. You have the biggest problem we had in coordinating state provincial efforts was the ballast water proposed by Governor Patterson in New York that would have in essence closed down the whole Great Lakes for commerce because of their location. And we had to work with the administration, the EPA, the Coast Guard, the other 7 governors, new Governor Como, and the 2 provinces and our federal government, A, to introduce in Canada the IMO standards on ballast water, and B, support the Coast Guard that has supported Canada, the U.S. Coast Guard, to get that standard in the Great Lakes, rather than having 8 different standards, starting with one that was proposed in New York that couldn't be workable. So then we had to get new Governor Como to, he's been good on this issue. We have a higher standard to protect our Great Lakes against alien species, invasive species rather, and commerce being able to be maintained, and we have new rules on bunker oil and other environmental policies for these lakes. Generally speaking, I think as much innovation that can take place in a business, in a city, in a state, lends itself to more creative solutions that ultimately get adopted by our 2 countries. Light vehicle emission standards, we had a standard in California, in BC, in Quebec, in Michigan, in New York, and now we have one standard, which incorporates also not just the tailpipe emissions that California had, but also it included conditioning. So I actually see that as a strength. Now looking in Canada, we've got different policies on climate and energy and different opportunities. In the morning I try to sell hydropower. In the afternoon we try to work on energy efficiency policies on climate change, and in the evening we try to get a pipeline approved. And then I have to work on rail safety later in the evening and make sure that we don't have top filling, this is important to GE, top filling rules in Canada that are different in the United States, breaking rules that are different on BNSF than CN or CP, and the whole issue of the 111 cars and the 2, 3, 4, 5 car that we're looking at, we align our timing and what our conditions are. So, but I think demands from business, communities, consumers, I think a lot of times on regulatory reform, we always talk about, I think it's good for consumers. I mean, you know, to go back to the Cheerios, it's good for consumers to have aligned regulations, and as well as for people to know what the goalposts are. But this is, you know, we're now working ahead. I mentioned rail. We're now working at one table, trying to work on one table every week on rail regulations to make rail cars safer. But we're still got, you know, and I'll mention GE because they're here. I remember there was an air conditioning energy efficiency proposal in Canada that was slightly different than the energy efficiency air conditioning proposal in the United States. Both of them would have improved the energy efficiency, but you would have components built in both countries with different, just slightly different standards, the nitpicking convention again. And so now we have a table. Going back to getting all these old ones is difficult, but at least going forward, hopefully we can align things at the front end instead of having these Australian railway track systems that don't align in our regulatory environment. I think creativity is good. I don't find it, and you know, I think you can say it's, you know, this is, BC's got policy, Alberta's got this innovation, you know, 12% cut of emissions. Otherwise, there's a 15% innovation fee. Saskatchewan's proceeding, I'm going to leave out provinces, but everybody's got, Saskatchewan's proceeding with carbon capture and sequestration with the Boundary Dam, Manitoba Renewable Energy. and Balkan oil. Horizontal drilling is good. We go right into North Dakota to get that horizontal oil. We don't tell Governor Hoeven, now Senator Hoeven. And is this live? Yes. Is this? And Ontario's got a whole boutique of energy. Hydro-Quebec is great to deal with here. The Atlantic provinces have all got different strategies. I think that's healthy. It's creative. And at the end of the day, up being an international agreement. Today's creativity will be tomorrow's agreement.
So we've been focusing a lot on the lakes and the St. Lawrence, obviously, but to bring it to another region that is shared and has the same issues of energy, environment, and shipping, the Arctic region,
Yes.
Where so far the framework is existent, but essentially we can kind of greenfield and start new problems we've had in the lakes for over a century and are only in the last 20 years trying to fix. Is there any discussion now on ways, both bilateral Canada-U.S. and perhaps more largely with the whole Arctic region, now that climate change is opening up the Northwest Passage and possible oil fields up there, to create or establish some kind of working framework for what happens when, because it's not an if, it's a when at this point. When we go up there, how are we going to manage it so that perhaps we can avoid some of the problems we've encountered in the lakes for the last century?
Well, the Arctic Council is a cooperative body of all the countries that are on the Arctic. And Canada's chaired that, and we've tried to deal with one of the reality problems for people living in the Arctic, where the Arctic Council was only operating on behalf of people living in Washington and Ottawa and Stockholm, and not for people that actually lived in the Arctic. So it was always perceived as everybody in Washington, I'll use Washington, wanted to make the Arctic a massive federal park, and including all of Alaska, and that there was no economic opportunity for people that lived there. Having said that, there's a number of environmental issues that there is a real consensus on with people living in the Arctic. And so an economic advisory council, which I think John Kerry is going to continue when he takes over responsibility as leadership of the Arctic Council in Iqaluit in mid-April. We've got search and rescue finally with the countries. We've got shipping safety discussions going on in terms of environmental sustainability and safety. We are there's no drilling approved by Canada in the Arctic right now. There's a Shell test site in the U.S. side that didn't go well. They had to suspend that activity. We want to have environmental policies in place for oil, gas, minerals, and we want to have agreement from all the Arctic countries. Russia, of course, is drilling in the Arctic. So we've got some challenges with Russia, Ukraine to begin with their invasion of Crimea. I think our Prime Minister said it right. I don't know whether they covered it in Cleveland, but in Canada, with Putin, he said, "I'll shake your hand, but get out of Ukraine." And that's our foreign policy position on Russia right now.
I have a question then.
Yeah.
How often does the president meet with Prime Minister Harper, and how often do they talk on the phone? I assume a lot, but I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, and they're very, on the phone when they need to. They meet a lot because, people talk about bilaterals with Nixon or Reagan or et cetera. They're together they were together in Brisbane. They'll be together in the Americas, the Summit of the Americas. They'll be together at an Asian meeting. They'll be together in Germany at the G7 meeting. Those are just the ones in the next 3 months. And there's always a discussion. It's like all of us. You go to dinner at night and you're talking about all the issues you want to talk about. So they are together a lot at these international forums. And most of what I hear at those forums, Canada and the United States as allies ever since the War of 1812. And just for those students, Canada believes we won the War of 1812. We never agreed on that, but we did win the War of 1812. But we're pretty, on most of those issues at those meetings, we're pretty close, working closely together. The biggest issue right now, and we just met with Ambassador Rice, and Secretary Kerry raised it when he came up to Ottawa in solidarity after the shooting in Ottawa. We talked a lot about the Iranian negotiations. We talked about it in October. We talked about it, I'm sure they talked about it in Brisbane. And then, of course, we talked about it with Secretary Rice to keep up to speed on what's going on, Ambassador Rice, rather. That's going to be a very, very interesting bilateral discussion between Canada and the United States if there is a multilateral agreement. Yes.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for taking my question. I go to school here. I'm a second year in law school, but I'm originally from South Florida. And I know recently the United States has announced somewhat of a warming with Cuba and the relations in that department. Maybe a easing of the sanctions and the embargo that has been taking place there. But I've been to Cuba before. I was there maybe 10 years ago. I am of Cuban descent. And when I go there, there's a lot of Canadians there, a lot of Spaniards, etc. So I was wondering, what is the Canadian involvement with Latin American policy in regards to Cuba too?
Well, a lot of time at some of the meetings in Cartagena, the big issue was, two big issues were the Falklands still, and with Canada has a relationship with the UK, and the whole issue of should Cuba be allowed to come to the meeting of the Americas or not. And the United States relies on Canada sometimes not to be alone in some of these discussions. The United States announced the potential relationship with Cuba. They're still subject to lots of negotiations and lots of disagreements. But I don't think you can have a better communication strategy than having Pope Francis on your side. I thought that was pretty, talk about being cagey. They had, how do you deal with that? But it's a lot of work. I mean, the Russian spy ship was in the harbor when our good friend Roberta Jacobson was negotiating with the Cubans in Havana. I'm sure that was a coincidence, that ship in Havana, so the CNN could capture it. But what's your opinion? I'm curious, if you're from Cuba, what's your opinion of it as a young?
Well, my grandfather's from Cuba.
Yeah.
I support easing of the embargo, and I know it's not a popular opinion in South Florida necessarily, but my grandfather supports it as well, and he goes there often for provide aid to Jewish population, specifically in Havana.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, obviously we had some political prisoners released as part of the discussion. But there's a long way to go. A lot of people, it's not a democracy. There's no freedom of press, all politics and everything else. But I'm always interested in young Cubans' views on this. I think they're probably the most important factor on what may or may not happen. So your views are very important.
And I think that's related to the president's position, though, is the younger people of Cuban heritage are much more open-minded about relaxing relations, including in South Florida. It's interesting. But that has been a trend for the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, and I wrote a prediction about the U.S. election, and I predicted every state except Florida, and it went by 1 point to the Democrats. Now, I don't know, some people say it's the demographics with the young Cuban voter not being the same as their grandparents, although it sounds like your grandfather supports it, or whether it was a kind of a 1 point shift after Hurricane Sandy, because the role of the federal government in disasters is pretty important. And I know they ran a lot of ads against Romney's position on FEMA and other disaster agencies in Florida at the last week. So I don't know all I know is I was wrong about Florida by 1 point. I got all the other states. But so it's interesting to watch the changing demographics in Florida. It really is. And as you know, if they give the Canadians a vote, they dual citizens, do they have dual votes? No, they don't. But there are a lot of Canadians down there. I remember talking to one congressional rep who will remain nameless, but she said to me, Canadians, why should I worry about Canada? They take up all the real estate and they don't vote for us. So, that's a very narrow view. I just very, very, very narrow.
I have a question that
Yes.
is a high-level question, and obviously you have a very dynamic personality, and it's wonderful to listen to you, so thank you. But as you practice your craft as a diplomat, assuming you're dealing with an interlocutor in good faith, what do you think makes for a most effective strategy so there can be a win-win result or you can achieve your goals? Just practicing what you do every day.
Oh, it's different with different audiences. Obviously, you're dealing with the White House and the administration appointed by the president. You're dealing with the Senate that just changed power, and you're dealing with the Hill. And to your audiences right away, who you're dealing with. Even in the oil industry, we used to assume because we were better than Saudi Arabia or Omar or Gaddafi that we could rely on making progress. It took us 2 years, 3 years to get the supply companies for the oil sands, like the companies in Illinois. We didn't even have that to go in to meet with somebody. So if you go in and meet with people, oh, we're Canadians, oh, you're wonderful, and you're nice, and we don't want to be nice, we want to be effective, and to be effective, you've got to have what it means for the people they're representing, the bread and butter issues there to start with, and then you can move to the broader issues of friendship and partnership in a more in your conversation. But I think you should start off with the 2 or 3 items why he or she should care about Canada in his district, in her state, or with the administration talking about things they may be missing on items that they may be making decisions about that they don't even think about or don't even get briefed about. But I think you really gotta, I don't want to go to a meeting with anybody without talking turkey to start with. And that's their job to deliver back to their so that would be my advice. And if you're dealing with a cabinet secretary, pay attention to their political history, because there's always something there that you might be aligned on, or some issue you might have dealt with together in 2 different sides of the border. Do your homework before you show up at a meeting. That's what I'm saying. Preparation is, like everybody here in law school, preparation is, you can't live without it. You can't survive without it. And don't have a hair shirt mentality. That's Canada's work hard, be strong, and enjoy what you're doing.
Let's hear it for Ambassador Gary Diller.
Thank you very much.